So the title of my talk today is Environmental Sensor Placement, which I think is something that we can all have a sense of intuition for what that means. And then with convolutional Gaussian neural processes, which is probably like 4 words that make some sense, but have probably never been heard in that particular order, unless you're one of my collaborators or have already read the paper that we're putting out on this. So what I'm hoping to communicate today is what convolutional Gaussian neural processes are and why they're particularly amenable to modeling environmental data, complex spatiotemporal environmental data. And as an offshoot of that, as a kind of downstream byproduct of that, being particularly well suited for the problem of finding informative placements for environmental sensors. So I think this aligns quite nicely with the SOOS observing system design goals. So it's really nice to be here today. And just full disclaimer, we are in the process of finishing up and publishing a paper around all this, which is currently on arXiv. And the latest version is going to be updating at midnight tonight. I hope no one is awake at that time, but I just thought I'd be precise. So please, come back tomorrow and have a look if I've whetted your appetite with this short introductory talk. So all of the results that I will be presenting will be from the piece of work that went into this study. And yeah, I guess I'm partly promoting this paper, but also super glad to be here to, just have a discussion about the approach and its limitations and the potential for taking this further and using it for the Southern Ocean. Now, I'm going to be really high level in this talk, and here's my high level kind of motivation for sensor placement. So let's say we're given the task of finding the best location to put the next Antarctic weather station. So I've got this kind of pictorial visualization of this problem here. Should we put a station over here on the Antarctic Peninsula? Should we put one by the Transantarctic Mountains over here near the South Pole? Should we put one over here, kind of near the British Antarctic Survey Halley base, a bit more inland? Or how about over here, more on the Australian side with, right on the coastline? Well, there's a super huge search space and design space here, so many different places where we could put environmental sensors. And the goal of, I suppose, observing system design is to try to tackle this from an objective point of view, using algorithms or models that can help to turn this really ambiguous, qualitative, hard problem into, simple analytics and recommendations that can be followed by human experts and, observing system designers. And one of the challenges behind this problem is that environmental data is so complex. The length scales are different in different places. You get these extremes, you get these seasonal characteristics, and that's going to present a real hard problem for using machine learning for this problem, which is the kind of angle at which I've been tackling this. Now I'm going to try and sort of formalize what I've just said a bit more, while also simultaneously introducing the convolutional Gaussian neural process, or ConvGNP. And this is my way of kind of parallelizing 2 slides into one in the interest of time. So let's say we start off with a set of 2-meter surface temperature observations at these land-based stations indicated by black crosses on the Antarctic continent over here. And we're going to call this a context set, which is using the terminology behind the machine learning paradigm from which the ConvGNP comes from, which is called meta-learning. So we're going to call this a context set, but we can also consider it a data stream. So we have this data stream of temperature observations of these black crosses. And let's say we want to predict at a vertical line of points indicated by these blue dots running down the continent, running through the continent along here. So we have these black, crosses with which to inform our prediction at these target points. But let's say we also have another set of observations, which could be, in this case, like gridded background auxiliary fields that could help us with this problem of predicting along these line of blue points. So as you can see here, we've got this elevation field that would most certainly help us with this task. We could imagine a land mask telling us where the ocean is and where the land is, just one kind of channel behind. And we may have other predictors as well, telling us the day of year or other kind of information that could help us with our prediction. So the way the ConvGMP works to achieve this task is by essentially first fusing these multiple data streams into a single representation, a single cube of data, essentially. And it does this using what's known as a setconv layer. And this is a real novelty of the ConvGMP. Previous machine learning approaches, which I'm going to completely just glaze over for the purposes of this talk, which are known as Gaussian processes, are pretty much unable to integrate more than one data stream. They can only integrate one data stream containing observations of the variable that they're trying to predict. And it's really finicky, if not pretty much impossible, to try to integrate this second context set. So that's one novelty of the ConvGMP. This kind of internal representation then gets passed to what's known as a UNet, which is a deep learning module, essentially, called Convolutional Neural Network. And this is essentially going to process the input data with multiple nonlinear layers containing millions of parameters that essentially turn this into a kind of high-level abstract representation of the data. We're then going to interpolate that kind of high-level representation of the data at the points at which we wish to make predictions. And that's then going to parameterize a joint Gaussian distribution containing the model's predictions. So you can see that represented here with this kind of normal distribution with a mean mu and a covariance matrix k. And you can see this bold black line is the mean prediction, and then we also have samples, joint correlated samples from this Gaussian distribution shown by the gray lines, as well as a full covariance matrix, which is shown with this heat map here. And the reason it looks quite interesting with all this structure is because this line kind of bisects several of these observations, which essentially leads to very low uncertainty and also kind of reduces the correlation between target points either side of those observations, which leads to this quite interesting kind of checkerboard structure going on here. But that's essentially the problem, and that's essentially the ConvGMP at a very high level. Now, the way we're going to train this novel machine learning model is using ERA5 2-meter temperature. And we're going to randomly generate context points, remember the input observations, which are shown on the left here. We're going to pass them into the model and make the ConvGMP predict at target points that are also randomly scattered across space. And this is going to be a Gaussian distribution at all of these blue points over on the right-hand side. And we're going to train this thing, which contains 4 million parameters in the case of our model, to maximize the likelihood or the probability of the true values that were actually observed by ERA5 at those blue points. Again, super high level, but that's just, that's a high level overview of the training scheme. Now, once we've done this, we find that the ConvGMP learns super interesting, seasonally varying and spatially varying covariance structure. And the kind of technical term for that is non-stationary covariance. So the kind of strength of correlation or covariance between two points in space changes depending on where you are, which is a crucial modeling characteristic for complex environmental data like surface temperature. And you can see the covariance visualized by these heat maps here by plotting point 1 as a white cross, white plus, and then plotting the strength of the covariance on a regular grid with that white plus. And you can see, for example, interesting stuff like decorrelation over the coastline, anti-correlation even, and with the South Pole having this interesting kind of drop off in correlation over the transantarctic mountains, which are shown by this red line here. So the models learned this super interesting structure that we could maybe leverage to find informative locations for new measurements. And that's what we're going to do now. So we're going to run this model using the machine learning paradigm known as active learning, which is where the model actively tells you where it needs new data. And what we're looking at here is evidence that the ConvGMP can accurately predict the true performance gain. And the way this works is using various notions of uncertainty in the model's predictions. So the first row is showing heat maps of the ConvGMP's prediction for the decrease in uncertainty when a new sensor is provided to the model at that location. So each pixel is essentially the value of how much the uncertainty decreases when a new sensor is added at that point. And the way that works is the model pretends it has an observation at that point. So we basically pass the model its own prediction and look at how much the uncertainty goes down. And I mentioned these different notions of uncertainty. So the first column here is looking at uncertainty about the spatial patterns, so the joint uncertainty. The second column is showing uncertainty in the pointwise values, so the marginal uncertainty in kind of machine learning terms. So that's ignoring the spatial patterns, ignoring the spatial correlations, and just looking at the pointwise values, those pointwise Gaussian distributions. And so technically what this is doing is trying to minimize the entropy of the model's pointwise distributions, which is this information theoretic notion of uncertainty. And then the final row here is the model trying to reduce its RMSE, so reduce the squared error. And that simply uses the decrease in the model's marginal variances, the absolute values of those marginal variances. And then when we reveal ground truth to the model at each point and compute the actual improvement in those performance metrics, we get these heat maps over on the bottom. And you'll see that there's a really nice kind of agreement and correlation between these heat maps in general. So the model is really well able to kind of rank different locations in terms of how much they actually improve the model's performance, which is a very important feature. And then, with this in mind, we can now run a kind of simulated sensor placement experiment with this ERA 5 data, which is shown by this GIF over on the right-hand side. So using that change in variance uncertainty reduction function to make the model say, this is the most important location. Then we pretend to the model that it has an observation there. Then we repeat. So then it says, okay, now this is the most important location. And then we repeat until we've placed 10 sensors. And that's what you're seeing with the animation on the right-hand side. And this is a greedy approximation where we place one sensor at a time. And this leads to essentially additions to the sensor network, additions to the existing sensor network that are in some sense optimal according to the model. And I think it's worth pointing out that these placements aren't just as far away as possible. And that's quite important. And that comes from the model's ability to learn non-stationary covariance structure. And that's a very important characteristic for environmental data. Now, this is one of my last slides now. So now that we know we can trust this model's ability to predict the value or the informativeness of sensor placements, we can then trade off informativeness with the cost of actually going there and putting a station there and maintaining that station. And we just demonstrate this in our paper in this pretty naive way, where we just say, let's pretend that the cost of deployment increases linearly with distance to the closest existing station, which kind of makes sense, you know, but it doesn't make sense because a lot of these are automated stations, so there's no people there. What you should really do is make the cost increase linearly with distance to the closest crewed station. Then it would make a bit more sense. But even then, there are many more ways that you could make the cost model more sophisticated. But nevertheless, the way you can trade off informativeness with cost is with multi-objective optimization, which we demonstrate here, where we use what's known as Pareto optimization, which can operate over any number of objectives. And it essentially prunes this very large set of solutions into a much smaller set that are so-called Pareto optimal, which are, in this case, the placements where you can't improve the informativeness without having to pay more, okay, without the cost increasing. And that leads to these red solutions, which are also plotted on the heat map here. And you can then remove them from the search and repeat iteratively until you assign a rank to each location, which is what's shown with the heat map here. And this could be useful for a kind of human-in-the-loop sensor placement recommendation system where they can consider the Pareto optimal set of locations and then take into account their expert knowledge as well as the cost of these various placements and use that to inform their choices. So you might be wondering, this is all atmospheric data. What about the ocean? So one idea that we posit in the discussion section of our paper is that you could adapt our model to, instead of proposing fixed station locations, propose trajectories of autonomous underwater vehicles, which I think is a really interesting avenue going forwards. But one of the challenges to bringing this approach to oceanographic data is scaling our 2D model to account for depth, which is obviously important with the ocean, and time, for example, as well. So that's something that's going to be something that we have to, really look into going forwards as we continue to develop this machine learning approach. And I might wrap up there just looking at time. This is maybe something that we can come back to in the discussion, but as part of my literature review, I found all of these interesting analogs between numerical or physics-based sensor placement or observing system design approaches and machine learning approaches from either the interpretability world of machine learning, trying to understand what the model's doing, or the uncertainty quantification, active learning side of things. And I just want to highlight one of these is adjoint modeling, which Nora Lusa gave a talk on in one of the previous SOOS OSD mini workshops. And our work kind of lies over here in this table. And in the interest of time, let's maybe just come back to this to dwell on this in more detail in the discussion section. But with that, I'll just wrap up and thank everyone for listening. So we've got this paper, as I've mentioned many times. If you were to pause this recording, you might be able to scan the QR code and open up the arXiv there, the link to our preprint. And I'd like to say a big thanks to all of my collaborators who significantly elevated this piece of work and what we were able to do, many of whom were from the university or are from the University of Cambridge. And all this work was also funded by the Alan Turing Institute, who we're hoping to continue working with on this method. And here are my contact details if anyone would like to reach out. Thank you.